Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to some of the people that joined from the previous workshop, and welcome to Jeremy. We're very pleased to have today with us Jeremy Anderson, Head of Strategic Research at the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF. Jeremy is one of the contributors to the online course, and today he's going to pick up on that conversation on rebuilding the economy by looking at the case of the transport industry, at the transformation of the transport industry, and then engage with you on the different questions you may have. May I just suggest that if you have questions that we don't want to make it by taking the floor, please put them in the chat by indicating where you're from and what's your specific question. And if you want to take the floor, that's fine. Just say your name and where you're from. So Jeremy, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Adlira, and thank you for arranging this, and thank you to everyone who's turned up on a Friday afternoon at the end of a long week. And but I really look forward to having a discussion with you over the next hour or so. And I'll just start by briefly introducing the topic around the green transformation for the transport sector. And I thought I'd start by talking about something that I didn't really talk about in the online lecture, which is the relationship between climate policy and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And like many sectors, the impacts on transport workers as a result of the pandemic have been very severe in different ways, in terms of the shutdowns that have affected industries like aviation and, for example, cruise ships, or other sectors like public transport or kind of road freight, last mile delivery, where workers have continued to keep working, but with significant kind of health and safety risks that they are exposed to. But at the ITF, we have kind of had a number of conversations about what this means for our sustainable transport agenda. And we do firmly believe that this really kind of highlights the importance of making sure that the policy response to the pandemic in terms of rebuilding the transport sector and protecting workers is really based around building towards kind of a sustainable future, and particularly around meeting climate policy goals, responding to the climate crisis. And there are several different aspects to this at the kind of macro economic policy level. There are kind of big discussions around government funding and kind of whether we can afford to pay for this. And I think this is a really important point for us as trade unionists about what we can afford, because one thing that the pandemic has really shown is that when there is an urgent need for funding in some societies, this funding can become available very quickly. And there's a very good argument that when it comes to the infrastructure that we need in order to invest for a sustainable future in terms of transport infrastructure, but also the economy more generally, as the societies, we definitely have that kind of funding available if we kind of assert democratic control over monetary systems. Now, there's a very important point here in terms of the differences between global north and global south and kind of ongoing power dynamics. And that is that kind of countries with kind of more developed monetary systems, most notably the US, which is a very powerful currency, but also Europe as well, have much more ability to do this. And other countries, if we look at what's happened recently to countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe, can run into real problems when they try to kind of use their monetary system. So absolutely essential in all of this is that we have a global kind of framework that allows all countries, including countries in the global south, to have access to invest or access to the funding to invest in green infrastructure. So that's one important point, and in the fact sheet I talk a bit about debates around Green New Deal. We're not currently using the term Green New Deal or Global Green New Deal, and that's because some of our affiliates kind of feel that this is a term that only makes sense to people perhaps in the US or Europe. And so we're trying to use language about high government investment, kind of fully unionized employment, to really kind of build kind of common understanding around this. So that's the big picture. And then I want to talk briefly about kind of what this looks like from the perspective of the transport sector, and also the importance of making sure that we really have kind of a strong workers' voice in this process, and make sure that kind of just transition principles are really central to the whole transformation. And so first, just around just transition, I think a fundamental principle for us is that kind of workers, and we really mean organized workers, trade unions, need to have a strong voice at the table. When we think about transport, climate policy will affect different transport sectors in different ways. Aviation is kind of a very challenging area because currently there's no technology that will allow us to keep flying at the same level and transition to zero carbon. In road transport, it's a bit different. If we invest enough in renewable electricity, we can, it will be possible to transition to zero carbon, perhaps. So there are some quite difficult conversations that we need to have, but absolutely critical is that workers have a strong voice at the table. When we look at recent history of many things that have happened around the world, there's a strong tendency for governments, companies, to think they have the solutions and they know better than the workers. But workers themselves have incredible knowledge about how their industries work and how the industries can work better. Often this is ignored. And what we're saying is that workers, the structures of companies and sectors need to be really transformed to make sure that workers have a role in managing this process, and to make sure that workers are not made to pay for the cost of the transition. So I'll leave it there, Edlira, and open up to questions and see how we go.
Yes, so thank you very much for that general overview. And actually, there is a very good question from Utaka from Nigeria, who thanks you first for the comment, and then he's asking to operationalize the sustainable, what would sustainable transportation mean for workers, transportation sector, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which is populated by informal work arrangements, that would transition to formality address the greening in the transportation, which is somehow linked to what the points you are making, but perhaps now more specific for these parts of the world.
Yeah, thanks, Mitaka. That's a really good question. And I think there are two things that immediately come to mind. So in terms of transport, 75% of emissions come from road transport. and kind of roughly half of that is from cars. So in countries perhaps like Nigeria, where kind of road transport is an even bigger part of the transport sector, what happens in road transport is really important. And I think this is, in terms of informal work, this is an area where kind of what kind of trade unions in countries like Nigeria, Uganda, elsewhere have been saying for a long time about kind of the risks of informal work, not only to the workers themselves, but also kind of the social costs of that become even more evident, or become even more important, that we deal with this question around the problems of informal work. So kind of one thing that you find with informal work and transport is that you tend to have kind of many, obviously very small firms that don't have access to the kind of the newest vehicles. They, whether it's kind of minibuses or motorbikes, either used to carry people or goods, often, you know, very old vehicles, maybe using diesel, and and very polluting. And this creates not only problems for carbon emissions, but also for pollution. And so this is something that we see as really important to address in terms of creating like a transition to a totally different system of kind of urban freight, where we properly fund kind of public transport, which strong kind of focus on public ownership, using the most modern and most efficient vehicles, but also making sure that there have been problems with kind of when there's been transition from informal to formal work, for example, around bus rapid transit, which is something that's been really highlighted by the World Bank, where they have said, okay, let's get rid of this kind of informal system with minibuses and replace it with a private sector system with kind of lots of very new, ultra modern kind of bus rapid transit systems. And often, the workers have really suffered in that process because it turns out that it's private companies that come in and kind of actually end up making a profit out of this with perhaps longer working hours for the drivers and things like that. So on the one hand, we need to kind of really make sure that the funding is available to transform the systems in countries like Nigeria, but also make sure that the just transition and the workers' voice element is there as well. And I mean, just to briefly finish, I think this is a hugely important question for the ITF. It's not just Nigeria. On the webinar yesterday, there was a question about the e-jeepneys, which is something very particular to Manila, the jeepneys, but it's a similar informal work dynamic. And and we need to really support not just our kind of trade unions, but the kind of informal workers organizations in these sectors that are really key parts of this just transition as well.
Is there another question? Somebody would like to take the floor, or please raise your hand if you would like to take the floor. Meanwhile, while we wait for somebody, Jeremy, what are the implications? I mean, you make the point in the video lecture in the course that particularly when it comes to the road transport, it will be really important that the electric kind of automobiles, so whatever, there is more access to those. But what does that mean? Should we continue with the insane, massive transportation, even if we shift to electric cars? Or are we talking about public transportation that is actually shifts to this new form of electric what do you call that, vehicles. So because my sense is that even when it comes to the electric cars, you do have a huge problem, the environmental problem, in terms of the, all the materials that go into actually preparing such cars, minerals and so on. So what is the thinking along those on these questions?
Yes, some big issues you raised there, Elira. So I'll try and kind of address them as best I can, but we don't have all the answers on this. I think one thing to say is there's something quite kind of unreal about climate policy, because when we talk about the kind of reductions in carbon emissions that are needed according to the science, they are so big that it's almost hard to imagine. So for example, when in 2010, the main kind of UN group, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said that by 2030, global carbon emissions need to come down by 45% if we're going to contain temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, and so this that's kind of the target that the scientists are all agreed on, is that we really need to aim for. But what happened is that between 2010 and 2018, carbon emissions continued to go up. So despite the fact that everyone knew there was a major crisis, the transport sector kept growing, other sectors kept growing as well. So now the target's actually even bigger. So the reduction was reduced by 45% from 2010 levels. But because emissions went to go up, we now need to reduce by 55% from 2018 levels. And we've only got 10 years between 2020 and 2030. And yeah, I think the reason that I raise this is there's such a big gap between kind of what the scientists are saying on the one hand, and then on the other hand, in terms of what's actually happening in the real world and how the world is responding. And it's so worrying and so hard to take in. The danger is that people just say this is too hard and let's just carry on and do what we can do. So I just want to acknowledge that, because I think it's really important that we kind of just have that big picture in mind and continue to break down this big challenge into smaller chunks. So it's a very general kind of context. If I now try and answer your question about what happens with transport, and I think so one thing is where we're very clear that kind of the overall model kind of needs to change. There's one kind of group who said, well, the thing we really need to do is invest in technology, because new technologies will be kind of the only way out of this. It's too hard to change the overall structure of capitalism, essentially. And there are a number of problems with that view. So one is that when we talk about particular technological solutions, for example, kind of battery-powered cars, we don't often talk about the kind of the downstream effects on the supply chain, which Elira, you mentioned in terms of kind of minerals mining and the sustainability around that, or even how we're even going to produce the electricity to power these batteries. So that all needs to be taken into account, and that's really important. And the second problem with technological solutions is, some research has come out recently that has shown that they never deliver what people think they're going to, and because everyone just says, oh, well, don't worry, we can keep going on as usual. The technology will save us. The problem gets worse. And then the technology doesn't deliver, and we end up in an even worse situation, which is what we're currently in. So, that's like another reason why everything is really, really challenging. But I think it's important that we use the kind of coronavirus crisis to think about how the overall model could be different. And this is a really sensitive issue, and for many kind of transport workers at the moment who are kind of facing kind of real uncertainty, or in some cases kind of actual job losses. So it's a difficult time for us to be talking with many transport workers about actually we need to have kind of less transport in the future. And so we don't have all the answers on that at the moment beyond negotiation. But at the same time, yeah, if we go back to this kind of question of public transport and kind of things that have emerged, for example, around kind of working from home, I think it's really important that we think or investigate more, or just think more about how we can kind of move to kind of more sustainable and lower carbon kind of ways of living. And is there unnecessary transport that we will not need in the future? So yeah, I can't fully answer that question, but it's something has to change between, on the one hand, us acknowledging that the technology is not going to be able to allow us to sustain this current model, and that we need like a different model for the sector, but one that doesn't kind of put kind of transport workers at risk.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. Appreciate it. We do have Ian has raised his hand, and I really apologize that I may leave in a few minutes due to a conflicting schedule, but Jeremy will look at the chat or at the hands raised, and then continue the conversation. So Ian, floor to you.
Good day, I'm Ian Hostford. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda. I work in the fisheries sector. One of the challenge I find, there seems to be a disconnect between what the environmentalists, the direction they want to go in terms of the environment, and at the same time, there's also a disconnect between the suppliers. For example, in the case of the fisheries sector, in the case of Antigua and Barbuda, much of the workers, owners have actually started to move to 4-stroke engine as opposed to 2-stroke engines. But in the whole process of doing that, they have actually decreased their resilience in the fact that, like prior to when we have issues like hurricane, individuals will simply remove their simple 2-stroke engines and store it for safety at home. With the new engines that they're actually using, they can't remove the engine. So you have a situation now, they are actually less resilient. You have the gains in terms of the environment, but the individuals are more at risk for loss associated with hurricanes, tropical storms, ground swells. So I think there seems to be a disconnect between what the technological supplies are actually providing us with and what the individual is expecting in terms of actually mitigating their risk. We're basically, we don't live in a country that actually produces engines or boats. Everything that we have is imported. And in the whole process now, because it's so complex, individuals who normally would actually maintain their engines and all these other issues, they are now tied to a retailer. So then there are actually, there's a lot more going in terms of maintaining the engine, which they can't do. They have to actually go to the retailer. So that is a typical example. There seems to be disconnect between what we want to achieve at the global level, the private sector, the workers. How do you see that we can actually address these types of issues? Because we're normally just consumers of what they produce.
Try and unmute. Thanks, Ian. That's a really interesting question, and I may need to just ask a couple of follow-up questions to kind of help me understand this situation better. So I assume that the four-stroke engine was introduced in the interests of kind of being more carbon efficient and lower pollution. But was it the retailers that were involved in financing this transition, and was there kind of any negotiation with the workers? I mean, are the workers organised, or do they have any collective voice?
They're not organized. They're a loose association, and that remains a challenge. We've been trying to get members to be organized in terms of addressing the issue. But even when you deal with the retailers, they would actually, they would be a subsidiary of a big company, whether it be, I don't want to call names, but they're the ones providing the input. So you really don't have much of a choice. You can actually import, but then you still would need somebody to do the maintenance. And the government has basically adopted a policy to tend to support the conversion to four-stroke.
Yeah, well, I guess just at a very basic level, this shows the importance of kind of making sure that workers are organised, and it sounds kind of like a classic case of a theme I was touching on earlier, when the solution comes from either the employer or a think tank or something like that. There's a kind of just a lack of understanding of how this is going to impact kind of workers on the ground, and perhaps the workers themselves would have better understanding of some of these issues. So the importance of negotiation. It's a really interesting example, Ian, because I think something that is worth kind of documenting in terms of how kind of these systems or these initiatives, shall we say, that are based on very unequal power relationship between kind of the retailers and the fishing the fishermen and women who, as you say, if they're unorganized, are in a very unequal power relationship. So yeah, I think it just shows the importance of kind of just really kind of understanding the multiple impacts and really pushing for kind of workers to have kind of a much stronger voice at the table. So just going to move on to a question from Phoebe, my ITF colleague. So he's asking, it says, the green economy is possible, particularly in Africa, if public transport service is improved. Currently, most people prefer driving themselves or using a cab to work rather than use public transport. And yeah, Phoebe, I think this is kind of a question that has become particularly perhaps or important or maybe difficult in the response to COVID-19, particularly where I am here in the UK. I'm not sure kind of whether this is quite the same issue in places like Kenya at the moment. But where for kind of safety concerns, everyone's saying, let's go back to private cars because public transport is understood to be a higher health risk. And so I think that's really kind of difficult question for us at the moment, because if we go back to private cars, then kind of many of these problems are going to build up. But just more generally, I think when we talk about transport overall, in terms of kind of what is proven and what we know will make a big difference, the single most important difference to lowering kind of transport emissions overall is getting people out of cars and into public transport. That will make the biggest possible difference. And so this is why kind of at the ITF and kind of my colleagues are making a really big effort around our public transport campaign to kind of really build public support, not just from workers, but also from people kind of who use public transport, for kind of well-funded, kind of publicly owned, really kind of user-friendly public transport systems. And yeah, this does involve kind of taking on some established interest around kind of car ownership. But yeah, we see that as kind of one of the most important things that we can do. And I think we really need to kind of understand kind of what it is that is going to get the public to support public transport, to want to use public transport better, more than private cars. So that's a really important point. I can't see anyone's hand up. Are there any more questions? I'm not sure. I didn't see Ian's hand go up earlier, so Harold, I'm not sure if I'm missing anyone's hand go up. No hands up. Okay. So if there are kind of any more questions, I'm very happy to answer them. I would actually just have a question for anyone who would care to answer it. But something that I mentioned earlier that we're discussing a lot at the moment is this question around the Global Green New Deal. So the Global Green New Deal is something, is a policy idea or a policy phrase that, as I said, comes out of the US originally, but has now been increasingly talked about, for example, at UNCTAD and international institutions such as the ILO. And we're just not sure whether this kind of, when we're talking to a global audience, whether this kind of confuses whether this people, or whether this is meaningful to kind of workers in different parts of the world. So what do people think? Would anyone like to answer? Does the Global Green New Deal, does that make sense as a term, or should we be looking for different language to get it explained to this program that we're talking about? If there's no kind of feedback on that particular question, I may assume that the Global Green New Deal is not a very meaningful term. But feel free to come back on that. Are there any other questions or hands up? Ian, if Ian is still there, would you like to come back on my attempts to answer your question?
Good day. I was just wondering, I'm not too familiar with the Global Green New Deal. I'm more familiar with such as like the Green Climate Fund. Those are things that we've been familiar with. I've not, this is the first I'm actually hearing about it. I think one of the challenges is just trying to find ways in which we can incentivize a lot of the policymakers, not just focusing more so on big companies, but the actual workers, you know, mechanisms that are actually put in place that workers are not disadvantaged, and looking at means where you can actually retool individuals for other types of occupation within the same sector, because there's a lot of emphasis on technology, and there's not too much focus on how would the labor market adjust to the changes in technology. So I think most of the discussion should be focusing more on that, because we're becoming more and more dependent on technology. When there are issues, particularly if your means of employment are dependent on the technology, then you're basically less resilient in terms of you have to make certain adjustments, because you always have to go back to someone to fix your problem. So there's this downside to the whole issue. I do not have an issue with the technology itself, but it seems there needs to be a mechanism where the persons who are actually using the technology have a bit more control. And that's at least my 2 cents on that matter.
So firstly, Ian, thanks for that response on my question about the Global Green New Deal. That's very helpful to know. And then secondly, coming back to this question of technology and transition. And I think this is really kind of critical for us, because unfortunately, when we look at kind of the recent history of kind of what's happened in kind of many economies around the world, where there have been kind of major transitions, either through kind of changing technology or through kind of globalization and production moving from one country to another. Unfortunately, in many cases, we don't have that many good examples of kind of workers in those situations experiencing a kind of just transition, where kind of one job disappears and they're able to move on to something that not only has kind of equal pay, but also kind of equal levels of skill development, job satisfaction, and of course trade union organization. But we do have plenty of bad examples, and I think this is an important thing to acknowledge, and we need to do a lot better. When we're kind of doing the climate transition. And when we look at transport, it is quite different. So on the one hand, we do expect that in public transport, because of the reasons that I talked about earlier, that employment in this sector will expand. And then the question there becomes kind of how good will the jobs be? Kind of will we be able to tackle some of the problems in the transport labor markets, for example, around kind of discrimination against women, appropriate kind of skill pathways for young workers, and so on. But we do expect kind of that sector to expand, and part of that kind of making sure that workers have opportunities is that we do have kind of opportunities for kind of lifelong learning, including around kind of what technological skills workers will need in the future. In other sectors, perhaps aviation and perhaps some other sectors, other transport sectors as well, there may be a case that workers need to transfer to other sectors in line with the long-term plan. And this is where we need to be really kind of strong in terms of kind of how these workers are impacted. Because, it's a question. If the work does disappear in one sector, what is the best thing that should happen next? Do those workers have access to, kind of further education, and then they're told, okay, well, here's a funding package or an education package, and then you're on your own, or then you hope for the best. I think we need to do better than that. I think we really need to guarantee that wherever kind of workers are impacted by the climate transition, that we need to make sure that kind of the income levels are protected, but also the more kind of general labour standards are protected, and in terms of issues around kind of job satisfaction. And we can't allow the transition to result in kind of in de-skilling, the race to the bottom, and kind of a drop in job quality. So that's just getting back to your question about technology. For me, Ian, that's partly about the real importance of us as a labour movement, kind of really kind of putting forth kind of what kind of education and lifelong learning that kind of all workers need, and all workers should have a right to, in order to kind of really contribute to the economy of the future. So I think that's a really important area to work on. I see that Mitaka has his hand up. Mitaka, would you like to take the floor? Okay, sorry for the silence here. I see that Mitaka's hand is up, but is currently on mute. So, Mitaka, over to you. Mitaka,
clear now?
Let's go ahead, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy, for the interesting conversation. I have two concerns. One is, how could the role of worker education be a catalyst for driving campaign on sustainable transportation? That is one. Two is the role of research in generating knowledge, and also which will be a basis for union organizing and advocacy. So these are the two issues that I like you to expatiate, and how that could help us in terms of giving a direction to the trade union movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitaka. Two very challenging questions there. So I think, with worker education, I think it's something that, in terms of the just transition that I was just talking about, we really kind of need to kind of develop as a union movement, kind of within unions, within global federations like the ITF, within kind of as a global union family, in partnership with academic institutions. Of course, the GLU being a very important part of that. Need to kind of identify kind of what are kind of not only kind of the most important areas for kind of worker education, but also kind of the most important ways of delivering the education. And unfortunately, kind of we are in an age where kind of many public education systems have been run down, and you know, this has negative impacts on kind of on workers in particular. And so one reason why I'm so enthusiastic about the GLU is that I think it's a fantastic way to try and bring people in the global labor movement who really care about education together. But I think in a way this links to the second part of your question about kind of what research is necessary around sustainable transport, because on the one hand, at the moment, there are many kind of big, powerful think tanks, major government institutions, putting kind of a lot of money and resources into kind of questions around sustainable transport, and the transition to zero carbon. And a lot of this is going into technology. A lot of this is going into understanding like the carbon footprint and so on. And so, for where I kind of sit in the ITF kind of global research team, we can't. We're very small compared to this enormous kind of research infrastructure that is going on in the wider world. However, I think it's really important that we focus on kind of two particular areas. One is kind of the work experience and worker knowledge, and really bringing that to the to the forefront. And we talked about a few examples of that. And so that is something kind of where kind of as unions we have a role in unlocking that knowledge and making sure that we kind of really put that into the mix or bring that before the key decision makers. But so that's one thing where kind of we all need to learn from the workers, and then the other side of it, which I kind of see our role as kind of trade union researchers, is in terms of all those things that are kind of going on in terms of all this research that's going on about what a sustainable future could look like. Really analysing which we think makes sense, which is logical, and which actually is going down the wrong road. For example, a lot of the stuff that comes out about kind of technological fixes. And we need to kind of translate this into education materials that can going to be useful for workers to help them them better understand kind of what's going on. So that's something that we're working on. We're not doing it nearly as much as we would like, but in terms of producing kind of education materials for public transport workers about what's going on in cities, for example, for urban delivery drivers, including in the informal sector. So we hope that this can be like a useful resource. And I just, so I hope that answers your question, at least partly, Mitaka. It's a very big area. And I'm just looking at another comment here from Phoebe. So green transition can be a scare if workers are not unlicensed. Workers need lots of sensitization to be multi-skilled. In case of job transition, they don't lose jobs but transit to another job. Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And I think the challenge that we have is the gap between perhaps kind of what workers see has happened in their own experience and what's been going on over the past kind of 10 to 20 years in terms of what happens to workers, which is not very positive in terms of these questions that Phoebe raises in many countries or in many sectors, and the type of future that we want, and kind of building confidence amongst our movement that this transition is possible, which I really do believe it is. But we are up against a power structure that has done a terrible job up until now of addressing these questions, and has really not kind of engaged properly with workers or taking these issues into account. And I think when you look at what's happening in the big institutions like the World Bank, institutions like UNCTAD, and many national governments, there is now a sense of panic that these issues are not being addressed and not knowing how to properly address them. So this is where we come in, and this is where we need to organise. So any other questions or comments, or does anyone who has spoken, Phoebe, Ian, Mitaka, want to follow up on my attempts to answer any of your questions? Ian.
I think we have to look at the issue in a broader manner, not just green transportation, but revisit how we design cities. I think that is critical, and the infrastructure we actually put in place. One the challenge I see, we seem to have this movement more towards temporary type of employment as one of the negative things coming out of using technology, say for instance, to work from home. So I don't know what the future holds, but it seems that we are on a trend moving towards more and more towards temporary type employment, in which case you're actually, in some cases, competing with, not just locally, but regionally and internationally because of the use of technology. But I think we also have to revisit how we design cities, how we work, mode of work. I think that's essential to have a good grasp of the problem. A lot of times we tend to approach problems in silos. We look at green transportation, but then if you look at how you design the city, well, that might has an impact on the way forward in terms of actually having a green economy.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And I think, one thing we're trying to do at the ITF at the moment, just in regards to cities, we put a lot of work into kind of building our public transport program, and which I've talked about, but we're also kind of now thinking about the relationship between public transport and urban freight. And urban freight is an area that is undergoing kind of major transformation, I would say, at the moment. Both whether we look at kind of the growth of kind of app-based kind of food delivery services, takeaway delivery services, and also kind of all what we call the last mile delivery from kind of internet retailing. And all of this adds up to a pretty big transformation in terms of kind of urban transport systems, and and some big issues about how we make sure this is sustainable in terms of overall city design. So I think we need to kind of really develop a much kind of deeper vision of kind of in terms of cities, for example, of what that ideally should look like. And also, I mean, the other thing I didn't talk about very much, but in terms of kind of the overall plan for transport, it can't just be a transport strategy alone. I mean, transport is interdependent on many other sectors, but I just want to highlight two when it comes to the zero carbon transition. So one is the energy sector. So at the moment, kind of oil and is the kind of main way that kind of most transport is powered, whether it's kind of the very dirty bunker fuel that most ships use, or the more refined kind of kerosene that aviation uses. And, you know, we need kind of major, you know, transformations in the energy sector away from fossil fuels and into kind of renewable electricity. And without that, the transport sector will not be able to kind of make the zero carbon transition. So that means, you know, there needs to be very big changes in that sector of the economy, which is very powerful. The oil majors are very powerful companies, also many unionized workers. So we need to, you know, talk to our sisters and brothers in, you know, in industrial and other federations about the transition. It's the same for kind of manufacturing, in terms of the types of vehicles, of road transport vehicles that are produced, right up to the types of ships that are built and the types of aircraft that are produced. Again, in terms of the transition to zero carbon, there need to be big changes in those sectors if we're going to make this zero carbon transition work. So I totally agree that we can't just focus on kind of one sector at a time. We need to really focus on, you know, we need to think about the system-wide perspective, while also focusing on what we can do in our own area as well. So I see that we're coming to the end of our time. I'm very happy to answer kind of any further questions if there are any. But Harold, you may need to go, I'm not sure. But if there aren't any other questions, thanks everyone for coming. It's been really good to get this kind of feedback for you. I hope I've been able to provide some answers to your questions, and I'd be very interested in kind of any feedback you have either on the lecture or on the fact sheets as well. So one new message. Okay, so I think we need to wrap up. So I will leave it there. So thanks again, everyone, and yeah, it's please on the kind of on the discussion forum on the kind of course website. Please do kind of post more thoughts or questions if you have any. So thanks everyone. Bye for now.